Everybody wants to sell us the good life. Advertisements create fear or a sense that we're missing out on something, and then they sell us the solution to the problem we have suddenly realized we have. For example, every single soft surface in my home traps disgusting odors. Embarrassing odors. The Febreze people told me this last night. And only Febreze can keep my guests from being disgusted by my foul and filthy life. And sure, I have a car, but from what I can understand of Matthew McConaughey's mumblings, I don't know. But I really need a Lincoln if I'm going to experience all that driving can offer me. I think if he was in the Lincoln I bought, I would get out immediately. I'm sure he's a fine person. Thousands of companies are constantly offering us the one thing that we're missing that will finally give us the life that they tell us we've always wanted. And in fact, we seem to have jumped shark when it comes to advertising. In the late 80s, so a while ago now, a couple of researchers published a paper in the Journal of Consumer Research that argued that ads were moving past just selling products and towards selling Americans a lifestyle of consumption as the good life itself. Just consume something, for heaven's sake, it'll make you feel better. But this morning I say, let's push the reset button and ask for a few minutes, what is the good life? Leaving behind, as best we are possible, all the messages we receive from people trying to sell us stuff. How do we live the best life possible? We're not the first people to ask this question, of course. A couple thousand years ago, the Cynics thought they had the solution. And we need to start with the Cynics because the Stoics, whose wisdom we're going to reflect on in a moment, really were the offspring of the Cynics. The Cynics were convinced that the luxuries afforded by wealth were not the source of the good life, and in fact were impediments to the good life. Diogenes, who is probably the most well-known Cynic, said, "Bad men obey their lusts as servants obey their masters." Because they can't control their desires, they're led along a winding path of want, buying this or that thing, having this or that success, only to find it doesn't satisfy what turns out to be a bottomless appetite for something to stave off our mortality. Diogenes and the rest of the Cynics preached that the values of humankind were all messed up. His illustration, as described by William Irvine in the book A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, was this. Diogenes would say, a statue, the only function of which is to please the eye, might cost 3,000 drachmas, while a quart of barley flour, which when consumed can keep us alive, can be bought for only 2 copper coins. In contrast, he believed hunger to be the best appetizer. And Irvine says, because he waited until he was hungry or thirsty before he ate or drank, he used to partake of a barley cake with greater pleasure than others did the costliest of foods. When asked about his lack of an abode, Diogenes would reply that he had access to the greatest houses in every city, to their temples and their gymnasia, that is. And when asked what he had learned from philosophy, Diogenes replied, to be prepared for every fortune. In other words, bad things are going to happen. The things and people you treasure right now, you will not have forever. You need, the Cynic said, to be prepared for all of them to go away because they will. And if they don't, you will. The Cynics had a very particular way of getting ready for that. Basically, they practiced preemptive poverty. They were essentially homeless, living on the streets of big cities. They had only one outfit. Not so unlike some principles of Buddhism and Taoism, the Cynics saw that attachment caused pain, and they stripped life down to the bare bones basics to avoid it. The Cynics wanted to tame that desire, raging desire, by living sparse lives. And they were evangelistic. One Cynic became known as the door opener because he would walk right into people's houses and start preaching to them the benefits of the lifestyle of a Cynic. The core of Cynic practice was, be prepared for every fortune. Like the Cynics, the ancient Stoics thought that was an important goal in the effort to live the good life. But Zeno, who started his career as a Cynic and then is recognized now as the founder of Stoicism, wasn't down for living on the streets and having just one change of clothes. So Zeno and the later Stoics said, sure, pursuing wealth and fame weren't justifiable ends in life, but there's no need to completely deny yourself either. Be ready for whatever comes, they said. Work on reducing your attachment, but also take and enjoy the good things that life brings to you without guilt. Irvine, the author of the book I mentioned earlier, boils Stoicism down to this paragraph. Virtue is the goal of Stoics. But tell a modern reader that the Stoics advocate that she live in a virtuous manner, and she might roll her eyes. Indeed, to this reader, nuns might be the prime example of virtuous individuals. And what makes them virtuous are their chastity, humility, and kind-heartedness. Are the Stoics advocating we live like nuns? And he says no. For the Stoics, a person's virtue doesn't depend, for example, on her sexual history. Instead, it depends on her excellence as a human being, on how well she performs the function for which humans were designed. In the same way that a virtuous hammer is one that performs well the function for which it was designed, namely to drive nails, a virtuous individual is one who performs well the function for which humans were designed. To be virtuous, then, is to live as we were designed to live. It is to live, as Zeno put it, in accordance with nature. The Stoics would add that if we do this, we'll have a good life. If we can maintain a focus, they said, on what's really important, we can achieve tranquility and live the good life. How does a person do that? Well, this is one of the most important pieces of advice that I take away from my reading in Stoicism, and I've mentioned it here before. The Stoics believed it was important to visualize the worst that can happen. So they advocated making meditation on big losses, even death, a central part of spiritual practice. In fact, they said we should visualize on a regular basis the deaths that would be most difficult for us to experience. So Seneca advised, when you kiss your child goodnight, remember that they're not your possession and could well be taken from you tomorrow. But also, now and then, daily or weekly at least, visualize losing them, but also losing the possessions that you hold most dear. I know that in our culture that sounds maybe drastic or macabre, but Irvine writes the following. To see how imagining the death of a child can make us appreciate her, consider two fathers. The first takes Epictetus' advice to heart and periodically reflects on his child's mortality. The second refuses to entertain such gloomy thoughts. He instead assumes that his child will outlive him and that she will always be around for him to enjoy. The first father will almost certainly be more attentive and loving. When he sees his daughter first thing in the morning, he'll be glad that she is still a part of his life, and during the day might take full advantage of opportunities to interact with her. The second father, in contrast, will be unlikely to experience a rush of delight on encountering his child in the morning. Indeed, Irvine says, he might not even look up from the newspaper to acknowledge her presence in the room. And when he finally does get around to interacting with her, the delight he derives from her company may not be as profound as the delight the first father experiences from such interactions. So, negative visualization as a practice can help us appreciate what we have, not take it for granted. There's this phenomenon that I'd imagine most of us have experienced if we're honest with each other. I'll use myself as an example. When I bought my first motorcycle, black, Honda Shadow, American Classic. I was thrilled. I bought it online, and they brought it in a semi-truck to this place where we lived in Indiana, way out in the country, and I watched them unload it, and I started it, and we played with it together before they took off in the semi-truck. It was shiny and sleek and just what I wanted. I rode it to a friend's place to show it off. A guy I knew with a couple of great big Harleys, and he called it cute. Well, now that wasn't what I was going for. But still, I loved my bike. But over time, I started taking it for granted. It was smaller than the big bikes I kept seeing. I'm a big guy. Don't I need a big bike? And it had a chain on it that I had to oil, and you have to kind of move it forward and oil it, and move it forward and oil it. Wouldn't I rather have one that didn't require that? Over time, that bike that I loved in the beginning, I began to take for granted. These two psychologists, Shane Frederick and George Lowenstein, call this process hedonic adaptation. That's a great name. Hedonic adaptation. It seems to be universal. If not, it's nearly so. We all begin to take people and things for granted over time. Negative visualization is meant in part to counter hedonic adaptation, to help us appreciate the good things we have and to keep us from being emotionally incapacitated if they should be taken away. Now, as I was preparing this sermon early this week, I kept thinking, what about all the children being pulled from their parents by the U.S. government? Does Stoicism have anything to say about our duty to them? We're hearing stories of inconsolable toddlers crying out for their mothers, and no matter how nice the staff is, no matter how much quality child care and how much good food these kids are given, what they need is their parents. Are we supposed to simply accept this as just the way things are and do nothing about it? I hope most of you know me well enough by now to know that if that was the case, I wouldn't be preaching the benefits of Stoicism this morning. In fact, Stoicism does not bless all the bad things that happen, but it does teach that bad things are going to happen. They just are. And without preparation, the Stoics said, those bad things will catch us so unaware that we'll be completely shaken. We may be unable to function, maybe for a long time. And they said, when we're rendered ineffective by the shadow side of life, we're no longer living virtuous lives. We are no longer fulfilling our purposes as human beings. While it's important for us to be grateful for our own lives and the lives of the people we love, even for the things that we have, and while simply squelching our desire to consume could probably save the earth from destruction, the Stoics taught that these things by themselves are not enough. Virtue demands more than that. Virtue, they said, includes a sense of duty. The great Stoic Marcus Aurelius wrote, "A human being is formed by nature to benefit others. And when they have performed some good action or accomplished anything else that contributes to the common good, they have done what they were constituted for, and they have properly what is theirs." We are interconnected, as the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism also reminds us. Remember the virtuous hammer, the one that's doing what it's suited to do. We cannot live virtuous lives, lives in which we are accomplishing what we're intended for, when we're not looking out for our fellow human beings. We are built for community and connection. We must then have compassion for and act on behalf of all these little ones being taken from their parents. Especially when we remember, as the Stoics encourage us to do, that they, like each of us, are only here for a short amount of time. And every day that our country treats them so horribly is another day stolen from them and from the parents who are grieving their separation. Virtue calls us to our duty. Stoicism leads us to the knowledge that the pain of our neighbors requires us to act. So let us remember that we're all, in one way or another, fortunate people. We all are. Let us appreciate what we have, remembering that we won't have these blessings, these relationships, these things forever. And having that knowledge, let us go out and live lives of virtue, full of good and important work, full of gratitude and even joy. Lives of virtue.